But I would like to get a little bit more law. Let me just quote from the president of the Synod in '92 when they threw out the old system and introduced the new. He said, "I believe," from your paper here, "that the time has come for the Synod not only to adopt better means of conflict resolution among us, but to state very clearly that any member of the Synod who engages in litigation against the Synod thereby forfeits his membership in the Synod, except perhaps in very unusual circumstances." All right. You got a bunch of religious guys, and they form a group, and one of them steals another guy's car, and he won't give it back, and he's not sorry. And because they're religious guys, they cannot appeal to Caesar for Caesar to come in and say, "You've got to give his car back." And that's exactly what Ralph Bowman did. He stole it, and he wouldn't give it back. And he threw out of the Synod the guy who appealed to Caesar so that Ralph Bowman and the Missouri Synod would have to submit to civil law. Throughout, now, reconciliation is what all of us pastors want to do. But there is such a thing as due process. There's truth. And I'm sorry, but listening to your paper, I don't see establishing the facts, applying God's law to determine who did right and wrong. Yes, we all want to vindicate ourselves. That's part of our sinful human nature. But there is such a thing as objective facts and objective right and wrong, and the issue is not the gospel. It's the law. And frankly, I believe that the biggest theological threat to the Missouri Synod today is the spirit of antinomianism that has simply engulfed us. I'm sorry, I'm preaching. With the spirit of antinomianism comes a denial of a vicarious satisfaction. Obviously, I'm not saying that about your paper or anything. I'm just saying I think we are facing a crisis. And this whole business of reconciliation, you can't talk about reconciliation until you talk about objectively determining what is right and what is wrong. And if we have lost the ability to apply the principles of due process to say this person has done wrong, well then I don't know where the gospel comes in. So, thanks.
I think inherent in the idea of reconciliation is confession and absolution, which means that God's law works on people's hearts to expose the fact that they are poor, miserable sinners who hopefully in turn will seek the grace of God. So I don't think it's antinomianism. I don't think it's let's just everybody, back to what was that book from the 60s, I'm okay, you're okay. I don't think that that's really what's intended.
Next question.
I was struck by the picture you painted of sitting at the table with the accused on one end and the 3 or 4 and the others on the other side. What role, if any, has a father confessor played in any of these proceedings? Has there ever been, or has it ever been allowed to have a representative there with the accused? It seems a little one-sided in that regards. Now, obviously, in the civil realm, we have a lawyer or personal representative there with us to assist. So just curious your thoughts and experiences on that.
Well, speaking especially with the latter part, my experiences is that the scene I described is one that has taken place repeatedly in my efforts in informal reconciliation. This means before the process ever starts, boom, 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 kind of a thing. And at that point, it's not so much, some of these pastors, and it's granted, it's not always a pastor who's going through reconciliation, all right? In my experience, most of my experiences have been that it's a pastor who's getting hammered by his congregation, and it can be over some ridiculous thing. And there's been many times where the pastor has just been a bullheaded idiot. And that has to be addressed too. So, at that point, it's not like somebody's going to bring a lawyer in or anything else like that. And usually it's not going to be that there's going to be people testifying at that point. It's more of, let's sit down and let's talk about what these issues are, and let's talk about it as we stand beneath the cross of Christ. Hopefully that pastor does have a father confessor. I know that there's been times where he doesn't, and all of a sudden I found myself in that role for him. And I think that's what needs to be done more and more.
Thank you for outlining, especially in the appendices of your paper, the process, so we can kind of understand how it all works step by step. Two of our papers yesterday, actually a lot of them were driven by case studies. Yesterday we had 2 case studies of dispute resolution, one under this current system, one under the adjudicatory system. In both cases, a appeals panel, or the highest court, so to speak, made a ruling and no one abided by it. And I guess, I was going to ask this question yesterday, I didn't get a chance to do that. That seems to be the most, a very fundamental breakdown, is when the process has been followed through, a decision has been reached, and then no one follows it. Sure. So I don't know if you've got any way to improve that other than people need to do their job, but.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with what Charlie was saying yesterday, about the who's guarding the hen house. I mean, so many of these things, unfortunately, are dependent upon who's in those positions of authority. And, if there's a big difference, if Matt Harrison is in a position of authority, or Jerry Kieschnick is, or one of my former district presidents, or another district president. And then the same thing on the appeal panel, adjudication panel. Anything can happen. I have served on adjudication panels where a pastor was wrongfully put out of his congregation, and thankfully our panel put him back in there. I don't know what happened after that. But, you can set up all the different, systems you can, the safeguards, but if you've got people in there whose mind is not set on, as I said here, which kingdom they're operating in, you're going to have trouble no matter what.
Question? Maybe a couple of questions, or at least some insights. Informal versus formal. Would you say formal basically is dealing with process, making sure process has been properly formed?
Well, at the initial stages of formal, that's where you get your witnesses and you get people to give 2 sides, and you hear that. Informal, that again, I think the informal is the most crucial stage, and all that you're doing there is trying to get people back to looking at things as a Christian.
I'm going to use this a little bit different language, but you're saying the same thing. Exercising the opposite keys.
Yes.
Can that take place in the formal process? Does that take place when there's the gathering of facts, interviewing of witnesses?
Well, I don't think, yeah, and I don't think it should cease at any level.
But primarily, it's more so in the informal process, I would suspect.
Primarily, it's more in the initial stages.
And so oftentimes the question, the comment was made, people doing their jobs. Very often, as you noted, it involves a pastor, not always, but very often. And so you have a pastor in a conflicted situation where you can come in as a reconciler and you can certainly speak the appropriate word of God to those people involved. But when it comes down to the exercising of the keys, who is to exercise that in that situation? It needs to move to a discipline for the sake of the brother. It's the pastor locally who should be exercising those keys and finds himself in a very difficult situation to do that if he's in the midst of a contention. And so rather than following our Lord's will in that, we go other routes, like the route of, well, let's get this guy a call and get him out of here. That doesn't fix anything. Or, which seems to be all the rage in the district I come from, is resignation, forced or voluntary. In your experience, do you find the keys being exercised in the informal process by the local pastor, and why or why not?
I would say yes. When you bring up the district, unfortunately, when I started out in the ministry, there was the perception that the district president was the pastor's pastor. And I think I benefited from that. But now I think it's he's now the bureaucrat, and in situations where brothers have been caught in certain sin or certain situation, the response immediately is one of discipline or suspension. And I often wonder, okay, but what about this individual's spiritual needs at this point? And I think that in some ways, the circuit counselor, although he's a representative also of the district president, sometimes I think it comes down to either the father confessor or a reconciler who has to take on that role of kind of helping to heal some wounds there.
It seems to me that maybe we're trying to use one tool to do everything. And most people have more than one tool in a tool bag. And I want your input and comments. The pastor gets sideways with his congregation. That's one thing, where God willing and the power of the Holy Spirit, we work reconciliation. But when a doctor of the church is teaching something contrary to the scriptures and our Lutheran confessions, is this the right tool?
Well, I think when it comes to the matter of doctrine, it goes back to what does it say in the operating manual? To go back to 1.8. If it involves a matter of doctrine, it says, specifically you should go back to 1.8 in this matter and have it, publicly talked about what the doctrinal problem is, and that should be kept in mind with the whole thing. You're right, you cannot reconcile bad doctrine. There is no such thing as win-win on bad doctrine, is there? So, is there a better way of doing it? Well, I suppose if the synod presidents and the district presidents, took more seriously, in some cases, their obligation to be overseers as far as doctrine, is what's practiced and how it's dealt with and discipline and so on. It's almost like they're taking some of these situations and say, well, it's a mess. Let's throw it over to reconciliation and let them deal with it.
Bill, just a comment. It probably relates a little bit to Pastor Royce's comment. I hope I get just feedback. It's just a general statement about process and dispute resolution. And that's how often I find there's a distraction away from the facts of the case, the issue at hand. What was, for example, involves a pastor in the congregation. Let's say it was refusing communion to someone who was not a member of the Missouri Senate or one of these type of things. And let's just say the pastor, takes a stand. He thought he had said everything he could the best way he could. But the accusation goes out, well, it's not what he did. It's how he did it. It's not what he said. It's how he said it. And then all of a sudden the whole thing becomes revolved around subjective criteria or assessments of the pastor and how nice he was or wasn't. And maybe even the pastor doesn't see it. Maybe he needs to be, maybe he was too hard. He knows he needs to be humble and learn that type of stuff. I understand. But in the process, the people or the complainants and everybody on the sidelines gets distracted away from the fact there was an issue of doctrine and practice there. He was trying to hold, he didn't expect it to come. And all they look at is, how he handled it or whatever. And pastor has to be humble. He has to constantly be willing to look at himself, that he is meek and all these type of things I understand. But that level of scrutiny or that way of doing things is impossible for any pastor, as you know, to ever live up to perfectly. In fact, if we want to do that, we should start with Martin Luther and how he treated Calvin and Zwingli and people like that. If we're going to talk about how he said this. So, your comments on that in dispute resolution, because that's a big concern of mine, that many times in these things, they lose sight of the main point that was at issue, and they get caught up in these subjectives.
Yes, I agree with you. And that's why, when you get to the later stages of dispute resolution, some of the questions are not, well, was this guy who is under scrutiny here, was he a nice guy? Did he do this lovingly? It's more of a matter of what are the facts? Is there a reason for appeal? Is there a reason for pursuing this based upon did this person do this or not? That's one of the things, by the way, when dispute resolution goes into those formal stages, there has to be a document set forth, a statement written setting forth the facts of the situation. Did this person do this? Did this church act according to its constitution? Did they do this? Not, well, what kind of impression did he give to people? Is he a nice guy? You hear this malarkey about, oh, you're standing in the way of the gospel, and all sorts of stuff like that. No, it has to be worded in such a way that it's an objective statement. And therefore, the dispute resolution panel is not there to say, well, even, what kind of personality are these people? Objectively, is this or is this not true?
One more question, and then we'll break. If you have questions of will you be around?
Yeah.
So you can be asked.
Thank you for coming, and I'll share with the group. There was some hesitancy when I called you and asked you.
Yeah, what's this Gentile doing among the...
He's not the enemy, folks, but he has taken on the task of trying to explain what we have, and I think the flow charts at the end, if nothing else, will give us some basic catechization of how the process works, or is at least supposed to work. I want to piggyback on Rolf's comments before about the litigation aspect. And as Pastor Porat said, in Nebraska, we have this epidemic of pastors being forced out. They're given the opportunity to resign their call in exchange for a generous severance package, and it's horrific. Oftentimes, the pastor is blindsided. I don't know where this fits onto the flow chart. It's not informal, it's not formal, but people have been plotting behind the scenes, oftentimes with a circuit counselor or a district president, and the people come to a voters meeting and they make a motion, and the congregation now is asking their pastor to resign, or they are reducing his salary to $1. Two things which have happened very recently in Nebraska, two different congregations. And now there the pastor is stuck. What does he do? And the either stated or strongly implied thing is that if the pastor hires a lawyer, or if the pastor does anything with regard to litigation, he's automatically kicked out. And yet the congregation has a lawyer, the district has a lawyer, they have these lawyers on staff, and so there's this seeming huge double standard that if a pastor consults, or heaven forbid, hires a lawyer to see what his rights are according to state labor law, to see what his rights are with regard to health insurance, any of these kind of things, he is perceived as violating Holy Scriptures and is immediately on the quick road out of the city. Is there any help that you can see from the experience that you've had to expose this seeming double standard, or is this only happening in isolated events in Nebraska, the Nebraska district?
No, I'm sure it isn't. And the one case where I was involved with, where I was on an adjudicatory panel where they were removing a pastor, the panel's ultimate decision was based on, we said, we said to the pastor, can you give us a copy of your original call document, which was signed by the congregation. And just by reading objectively what that congregation promised to do for their pastor, it was clear that the congregation had violated what they said that they would do. And I mean, that sounds rather simplistic, but maybe sometimes that's the simplicity that we need, is let's just go back to the call document and say, this is what you pledged to do for your pastor. You know, praying for him and everything else like that, but supporting him and all these different things. I can't remember the exact wording, and maybe the documents have changed over the years, but I think that there's something binding right there that should cause the congregation to go back and say, these clandestine meetings where all of a sudden we decide to do this or cut his salary to $1 or whatever is just in violation of what we did pledge to him when we called him to come here.
In the congregation, In the congregation, when the congregation voted to reduce the pastor's salary to $1, the pastor called the district president the next day. A hastily arranged voters meeting was called, and the district president got up before the congregation and said, "You can't pay your pastor $1. We have a minimum wage in Nebraska. You can't reduce the pastor's salary to anything less than minimum wage in the state." Honest truth. And so nobody said, look at the call document. Nobody said, let's see the promises that we made. What we did was apply to a different law to try to correct the obvious sin that was going on. So people need to be called to repentance. And where is the jurisdiction with regard to who has the office of the keys in that particular? I think that's when we have a major breakdown.
And, and just in close, I agree with you, everything you're saying, but wanted to make the point, repeat as I did in the paper, is that you can put all the safeguards you want in there, and stuff is still going to happen. And it still means you and I are called upon to bear the cross. And for those of you who have been ousted from your position or going through that, I empathize with you. I've been there myself. And I know the kind of toll it takes on a family and on an individual. But the truth of the matter is, this is the cross. We're bearing the cross.